Viking smiths packed their blades in the bones of the dead. They believed the spirit of the ancestor would enter the steel and make it unbreakable. They were right about the result, completely wrong about why. What they were actually doing was advanced carbon chemistry that science would not formally explain for another 900 years. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal story of how the most feared weapons in medieval Europe got made. And it starts not in a forge. It starts in a swamp. Before a single sword existed, before any fire was lit, before any hammer fell, there was a bog. A cold, dark, oxygen-starved wetland somewhere in Scandinavia. At the bottom of that bog, invisible to anyone walking past, something remarkable was happening. Bacteria, microscopic iron-oxidizing bacteria, were pulling dissolved iron right out of the groundwater and depositing it as reddish-brown nodules in the peat. Slowly, over years, those nodules built up into harvestable ore. The weapon that terrorized medieval Europe for 800 straight years started with bacteria. Living organisms doing their quiet biological work in the mud, growing the raw material for Viking swords. Think about that the next time someone calls the Viking Age primitive. The ore they harvested from these bogs is called bog iron. And compared to the high-grade ores we mine today, it is genuinely terrible. Hematite, one of the main ores used in modern steelmaking, runs about 70% iron by weight. Magnetite hits around 72%. Bog iron, about 45%. It is also riddled with phosphorus contamination, sometimes up to 10% by weight, which makes the raw iron cold, brittle, and prone to shattering under impact stress. On paper, bog iron is a bad starting material. In practice, Viking smiths figured out how to turn it into blades that modern metallurgists still study with genuine respect. Here is something that should completely change how you think about Viking civilization. These communities were not just grabbing whatever they found and hammering it into shape. They managed their bog iron the way a farmer manages a crop field. Bog iron is renewable. Harvest a bog, leave it alone, and in about 10 years the bacteria have regenerated a fresh layer of ore. Viking communities returned to the same bogs for generations. The ore collection happened in spring, when the water table dropped and the nodules were accessible. Smelting happened in autumn, after the harvest was in. The entire iron production calendar was woven right into the agricultural year, a managed industrial resource running in the 800s CE. So how does it actually work? How do you go from a handful of rust-colored nodules pulled out of a swamp to a blade that can hold an edge? The first step is roasting. You pile the raw ore onto an open fire and let it burn for hours. The heat drives off moisture and chemically converts the ore into a form that will react more readily in the furnace. The nodules crack open, turn darker, and what comes out is a crumbly reddish-black material ready for the real work. Then comes the bloomery furnace. Picture a cylinder of clay, about 3 to 4 feet tall, built fresh for each smelt. The smith loads it in alternating layers, a charge of charcoal, then crushed roasted ore, then charcoal again, and lights it from the bottom. Leather bellows or tuyere pipes at the base force air through the burning charcoal, pushing temperatures up to somewhere between 2,200 and 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt glass. But here is the thing. Iron melts at around 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The bloomery never gets that hot. The iron does not melt. It never becomes liquid. Something more interesting happens instead. At those temperatures, the burning charcoal produces carbon monoxide gas. That gas rises up through the ore charge and chemically strips the oxygen atoms right off the iron oxide molecules. What remains is iron, but not clean, dense iron. It collects as a spongy, porous mass called a bloom. Looks like a glowing red sponge soaked in slag. The whole smelt takes somewhere between 4 and 8 hours. The efficiency of the process is brutal. Experimental archaeologist Daryl Markwitz ran 101 documented smelt tests using authentic materials and methods. His results, roughly 11 pounds of bloom from 66 pounds of ore input. That is about 16% efficiency. A finished Viking sword requires 2 to 4.5 pounds of quality iron. Do the math. You might need multiple full smelt cycles just to accumulate enough material for a single blade. At sites like Heglasvollen in Norway, archaeologists excavated 4 furnaces sitting alongside 96 tons of slag. Not pounds, tonners. Industrial-scale production across generations, all fed by the bog. The moment the smelt ends, the furnace gets broken open. The smith reaches in with heavy tongs and pulls out the bloom while it is still glowing. What happens in the next few minutes matters more than almost anything else in the entire process. The bloom has to be hammered immediately, a technique called shingling, to beat the trapped slag out of the porous iron structure before everything cools and locks in place. The smith is reading color. Bright orange means go. Dark red means you are running out of time. Black means you just ruined the bloom, a skill that takes years to develop. No thermometer, no second chance once the iron cools below working temperature. After consolidation, the iron gets worked into rectangular bar stock, trade bars that could be sold, shipped, or stockpiled until a smith needed them for a specific commission. That bar stock was currency in the Viking world, but here is where it gets genuinely fascinating, and it is the part that most history content completely misses. Bog iron bloom is not consistent. Within a single mass, the carbon content varies wildly from one section to the next. A skilled smith working this material was not handling a uniform product. He was handling a highly variable raw material that required reading and decision-making at every step. That inconsistency in the right hands became an advantage. Carbon is what separates soft iron from hard steel. Pure iron is tough but soft. It bends, it deforms, it will not hold an edge. Add carbon up to about 1% by weight, and you get steel, harder, stronger, capable of holding a razor edge. The challenge with bog iron is getting that carbon where you need it in a controlled way. One method is cementation. The smith packs the iron bars or blade blanks in a sealed clay container with carbon-rich material, charcoal, ground bone, horn, and heats the whole assembly for an extended period. Carbon atoms slowly migrate into the surface of the iron, roughly 1/8 of an inch deep. Repeat enough times, and the surface carbon content climbs into the range, where it behaves like proper steel. Now here is the part about the bones. Viking-age smiths had a documented practice of packing their blades specifically in burned animal bones, and in some accounts, the bones of respected ancestors or warriors. The belief was spiritual. The strength and spirit of the dead would pass into the blade. Old Norse sources record it. Physical evidence from forge sites confirms it. Burned ground bone is extraordinarily rich in carbon. When a smith packed a blade in ancestor bones and heated it for hours, he was performing cementation carburization. He had no atomic model of carbon chemistry. He did not know what carbon was. He just knew that this specific ritual produced harder blades, and so the ritual got passed down as sacred knowledge. The metallurgy and the spiritual practice were the same thing, described in 2 completely different vocabularies. Viking smiths were doing controlled materials science. They called it something else entirely. Analysis of Danish Viking-age blades has found carbon content averaging around 0.8%, which matches the performance range of what we would today call medium carbon steel, not primitive attempts at bladed weapons. Precisely engineered tools hitting a specific material specification, produced by craftsmen who knew exactly what result they were after, even if they described the process in spiritual terms. Pattern welding takes all of this even further. You may have seen images of Viking swords with flowing, almost organic patterns visible in the polished blade surface. Those are not decorative, they are structural. The smith takes alternating bars of soft iron and harder carburized steel, forge welds them together, then twists the composite rod and welds it again, building up a layered structure that Norse poets called the serpent in the sword. The center of the blade ends up as a flexible, tough core that resists breaking. The edges are separate, harder steel, capable of taking and holding a sharp edge. Grind and polish the surface, and the alternating layers reveal themselves as that flowing, wave-like pattern. A composite engineering solution, flexible where it needs to flex, hard where it needs to cut. One piece of material cannot do both, so Viking smiths built the blade from 2 materials, precisely placed. Neutron imaging of 3 Viking swords from the National Museum of Denmark, done without cutting the blades open, confirmed that composite rod structure in full detail. 8th century engineering confirmed by 21st century scanning technology. And then there are the Ulfbert swords. Of 167 swords recovered across Europe bearing the Ulfbert inscription, metallurgical analysis has been done on 44 of them. 11 are genuine Ulfberts. 11. The real ones are made from crucible steel, ultra-high purity alloy with carbon content between 1.2 and 1.6%. That material did not exist in Scandinavia. It came from Persia and Central Asia, moving up the Volga River trade routes into Viking hands. The genuine Ulfbert was a premium import product, a performance blade that outclassed anything a local bloomery could produce. The other 33 analyzed swords? Pattern-welded bog iron blades, stamped with the Ulfbert name, sold as genuine. The Viking Age had a counterfeit luxury goods operation running for at least a century. Somebody was making knockoff swords and branding them with the most prestigious sword name in Europe. Not speculation, the metallurgy makes it plain. The carbon content tells the story the blade cannot hide. Here is something almost nobody in the United States thinks about. Bog iron is still forming right now, not just in Scandinavia, in Canadian wetlands, in the Midwest, in the Great Lakes region. The same iron-oxidizing bacteria doing the same slow work, building the same reddish-brown nodules in the same cold anaerobic mud. The process that armed Viking raiders is continuing, uninterrupted in American swamps today. And American history connects to Viking metallurgy more directly than most people realize. Around 1000 CE, Viking settlers at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, the only confirmed Viking site in North America, smelted bog iron on site. Earliest confirmed iron production in the entire Western Hemisphere. Viking metallurgy touched this continent before any other ironworking tradition. Then, in 1646, the Saugus Iron Works in Massachusetts, one of the first industrial ironworks in colonial America, also ran on bog iron harvested from local swamps. The same process that put blades in the hands of Norse raiders also built early American industry. One last thing about the cost of a Viking sword, because it reframes the whole picture of Viking society. A basic, functional sword took a skilled smith roughly 1 full week of labor. That alone made it valuable. A high-status pattern-welded sword with a decorated hilt and a fully carburized edge has been documented at over 200 hours of skilled work. 5 full working weeks. For one weapon, these were not mass-produced items. Not handed out to soldiers, a sword was inherited wealth. It passed from father to son to grandson with a name attached to it, with a history, with the accumulated labor of the smith and the accumulated meaning of everyone who had carried it before. When a Viking warrior went into battle with a sword, he was carrying months of someone's life in his hand. That context changes how you read every saga, every burial, every museum display case. The sword was not just a weapon, it was a statement about who made it, who owned it, who bled for it, and what it cost to exist in the world. A swamp, bacteria, a clay furnace, a man reading color in the dark. And at the end of it, a blade that could hold an edge for 1,000 years and still sit in a museum case today, studied by scientists with equipment the smith could not have imagined, and impressing them anyway. So here is the question I keep coming back to. If Viking smiths were doing carbon chemistry 900 years before anyone had a name for it, just by following what worked and building the knowledge into ritual, what else do we do today that future scientists are going to look back on and say, they had no idea why it worked, but they were right? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. If this changed how you think about the Viking Age, hit that like button and share it with someone who still thinks these people were just raiders with axes. And make sure you are subscribed, because next time we are going somewhere even stranger. The Roman engineering secret that was lost for 1,500 years and only rediscovered by accident in a modern laboratory.